Welcome to my channel, Delightful Stories. I'll be happy if you subscribe to my channel and like it. Enjoy watching and don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments about the story. The sun's rays gleamed on the domes and illuminated the white walls of the church, advantageously making it stand out against the gray of the city. At the entrance stood a woman in her 40s. Her face was marred by a mournful expression. A black shawl covered her head, her eyes hidden behind the glass of her sunglasses, not standing out. The dark clothing emphasized the fact that the woman was in some kind of grief. She was immersed in herself and her unhappy thoughts. So she did not immediately hear the muffled beats of music in the distance, which gradually came closer and louder. An expensive car came around the bend. The music was coming from there. It was unusual and wild to hear club music in a religious place. However, the owner of the luxury car cared little. When the car stopped at the entrance to the temple, a long-legged young girl of model appearance in bright clothes, emphasizing all the charms given by nature, got out of it. Kaki knew how to present herself and how to behave in secular life, but not in a religious place. She headed inside the church. A grieving woman looked at the girl judgingly. As she entered the house of God from the street, she was disgusted by this inappropriate behavior on the part of the young woman. Casey, however, paid no attention to it. She went inside and made her way to the coffin beside the altar. In it lay a young, still handsome man, even after death. Charles was Casey's husband, and today she was to bury him. There was not an ounce of grief or regret or sympathy in the girl at this. Moreover, on her face now and then came the idolized native grimace, and she could barely contain her laughter. It was as if she had gotten rid of an annoying fly, not lost her husband. To stay longer beside the deceased, the widow did not see fit. After a minute at the coffin, she headed for the exit. After stopping just a second in front of the grieving woman, she talked to Barbara about the rest of the funeral arrangements. "Now this is on you. Try to dress more sparingly. You see, a lavish funeral is no longer necessary." He waved it off. And after thinking about it, added, "I guess this will be my last order for you. I do not need your services anymore. After the funeral, we'll settle up and say goodbye." Shocked, Dorothy could not find the words to respond to this unfair treatment. She simply nodded, then stared after the car as it drove away. She was simply discarded like an unwanted thing, an obsolete toy. And this despite the fact that she had served in this house for 10 whole years. In the meantime, the new widow was already booking plane tickets to her new life without her husband. She decided to start with a visit to a fashionable resort. Memories came back to Dorothy 11 years before the incident at the church. She had been spoon-feeding her sickly lying mother like a little baby, just as her mother had fed her when she was sick. Of the vivacious, hard-working, vivacious woman, all that was left was a shadow that was so thin it looked like a pie on pillows. The kind eyes glittered with a feverish fire. It was hard for Dorothy to watch the person dearest to her fade away. "Everything will be all right. Mother, you will like you soon. The doctor says your tests are getting better and better." She was lying and she had a lump in her throat with bronchitis. "They miss you. They're used to you. They're used to you. But where would they go without you? Will you go now to beat the sore? I need strength. Mother Power, don't talk." Her eyes were shining and she had emotions, mistrust, resentment, warmth. Dorothy was taking tests. Each time it got worse and worse. The treatment for which she had had to sell everything from the job she loved and move to this abandoned dusty hut was having no effect. But she could not give up. Mom had to live. She had to believe that everything would work out. Yes, feeding her mother. She went outside for some fresh air. A lump in her throat burst out in deafening buildings. Dorothy covered her face with her hands. No one would see her here. There was no need to hold back. Her world was shattered. A few months ago, she worked as a teacher in a rural school. Dorothy wanted to give her children what she herself had been deprived of as a child. Her mother had worked all her life as a milkmaid on the local farm and raised her on her own. Her father ran away as soon as he found out she was pregnant. It was hard, poor, but mother and daughter coped. Dorothy could not reproach her mother for not trying to give her daughter a happy childhood. She had a rough time at school, since they lived in a small village. School had to travel every day to the district center by bus. The village girl immediately became a black sheep among the city boys. They often mocked her, teasing her for her kindness and naivety. They also envied little Dorothy's success in school because, despite all the difficulties, she liked to learn. She tried her best and she was good at science. That resulted in the only gold medal in school that year. She especially took a beating from John. He was the son of local businessmen, so from a young age he felt chosen over others. Bullying of children was the norm, and teachers couldn't do anything about it, fearing the wrath of the boy's powerful father. Dorothy he loved in a special way, for she was the smallest in the class. Plus, she was an honor student with an unflappable appearance. In general, the offensive nickname was pinned on her with enviable regularity. Dorothy put up with it. She didn't know how to stand up for herself, and there was no one to stand up for herself, and there was no one to stand up for her. The other children were either supportive of John or they were afraid of incurring a torrent of bullying themselves. One day, a newcomer came into their class. His name was Charles. He was a big, athletic teenager with regular features and a companionable disposition. Without much effort, he won the favor of most of his classmates, though he was from the same village as Dorothy. His parents had moved there, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. At the same time, almost all the girls in the class fell in love with the newcomer, who were impressed by the unusual for their province handsome man. Dorothy couldn't resist either, but the modest, quiet girl outlived her impulses within herself, for she thought the lid on the lock was no match for him. John disliked the newcomer, who unwittingly took all the girls' attention away from him. Before Charles came along, he had been the center of attention and a crowd favorite. He liked it. He didn't want to give in so easily. He was afraid to confront them directly, so he only began to humiliate the weaker classmates more. That day, John targeted Dorothy again. He had seen a trick with a bucket over his head in one of the comedies. The bully decided to try it out on the little honors girl. Everyone had known for a long time that Dorothy came to class later than everyone else because she was helping her mother with chores in the morning. John knew that the teacher was sick, which meant that no one but Dorothy would come through the door, securing the bucket of slop so that it would fall on the girl. As soon as she takes a step into the classroom, he prepared himself to wait. Charles looked on disapprovingly, but didn't really understand what the local Sharemet was up to. He was quietly preparing for class. Footsteps were heard in the hallway. It was Dorothy. Only now Charles realized the idea and jumped sharply to the door. And when Dorothy opened it, he held the bucket so it wouldn't spill out on the girl. She walked in, not understanding why the whole class was looking at her in amazement, as if there was something wrong with her. And then she looked at Charles, then up, and was horrified. "Dorothy, stand back. It's hard to hold," Charles said. The girl quickly walked away to her seat and looked at the savior with round eyes, still not understanding what had happened. Charles carefully put the bucket down, trying not to spill anything. Then he walked over to John and rolled him with the slop. The class froze. No one could have imagined that this could happen to the main bully of the class, that someone would dare humiliate him. Then, however, the class erupted in laughter. All red, humiliated, a situation that had happened to him for the first time in his life. He lunged at Charles with his fists, but was stopped by a well-placed punch in the nose. Charles didn't like to fight, but he knew how, so a few more small blows toppled him to the floor for Faith. In a puddle of slop, he was beaten, but tried to get up and pounce on the girl's protector once more. The result was the same. Only this time, John also got his nose smashed. The boy quickly jumped out of the classroom. There was no one to stop him. Charles went out after him, but not to continue hitting him, but to wash his hands after him. When he returned, he sat down next to Dorothy. "Thank you." The only thing the girl could squeeze out was a deep blush. "I don't like to make fun of the weak," Charles replied. "Too bad, now I have to go to the principal's office. My parents will call me to the school." John became inconspicuous after this incident. Charles didn't want to escalate the conflict either. And Dorothy fell even more in love with her protector and thought that if he protected her, he loved her too. She didn't know how to explain herself, what to say, how to develop a budding relationship. Her first crush led her to decide to give. After all, the best she could give. Her mother had raised her to be a housewife, so the girl had been able to cook perfectly since she was a child. Dorothy baked pies and plucked her most favorite rose in the flower beds near the house. The girl knew that Charles liked to disappear to soccer in his spare time. That's where she discovered him. The soccer players were just going home. And the timing was perfect. He said goodbye to his friends, and she called out to him. Charles approached. "Hello, Dorothy. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you for sticking up for me." Elizabeth handed him a handmade basket of patties. The soccer player was very hungry, so he refused. "Dorothy," continued Charles, "I have something else to confess," the girl said. And there was a pause between them. After gathering her strength, she continued, "I have a confession to make. I like you very much. Long liked you from the first days after you came to our school." Charles stopped chewing. His eyes slowly rounded. He hovered for a few seconds, then spoke slowly. "Thank you for the pies. I'll have another one. It's very good. Dorothy, I can't return the favor. That's a good girl, but you've got to grow up. I'll run, okay? Don't be mad at me." With these words, he returned her basket of roses and quickly walked away, leaving her standing there with a broken heart. And so Dorothy, 30, she took the advice. Grown up, she grew into a beauty with beautiful hair, expressive blue eyes, and sensuous lips. Despite her looks, she was still single. Dorothy turned out to be the type of woman who can only fall in love once. And she had already used her attempt. She was afraid of being heartbroken again. And so through the years, she carried the bright feeling with her. She did not see Charles after school, for the active young man had gone off to conquer the capital, to build a business there. Such rumors reached her from common acquaintances. Charles's parents remained here, clinging to the land. And then one day, the measured course of the young teacher's village life was disrupted by a student who literally flew out into the classroom. Lessons were over, but Dorothy decided to stay longer so she could check the tests on the spot and not drag them home. "William, you're an open-minded loser," as the young literature teacher called the boy. He flew into the classroom. William came in. He tried to tell her something, but he could not catch his breath from the rapid run. She poured the student a glass of water. William said to Dorothy in a low voice, "I was in as much of a hurry as I could. There at the farm, your mother got sick. The ambulance took her to the regional hospital. Couldn't get you on the phone. So I came running." "Thank you, William." That's all the teacher could squeeze out. The reception at the school was really poor, which usually helped teachers when they were struggling with their students' gadget. Dorothy quickly headed home on her way, calling the hospital. I asked if her mother had really been admitted. Then I found out what to take with me, and a few hours later, closer to the evening, I was already at my mother's bedside in the ward. It was bad, very bad. Dorothy didn't hide her emotions as her mother didn't come to her senses. The first day, she couldn't believe that this misfortune had happened at all. The doctor said that hard physical work plus a predisposition at a genetic level, triggered the disease. But he was reassured that there was a chance for recovery. There was a good chance that my mom will recover. However, the surgery costs money. Large sums of money are needed at the film forum. Dorothy settled back in the nearest chair. The doctor nodded understandingly. Dorothy, I know it's a lot of money, but we've tried all the treatments available to us. We'll keep trying. But it's a complicated case. I'm going to say something, maybe unpleasant, but you should think about whether it's worth it. If you don't have any money, or if that's all you have, Mom is old. The doctor staggered back, meeting the ashes, the teacher's gaze, and mumbled something, then withdrew, leaving Dorothy alone with her thoughts. Later, she thanked the doctor for those words, because they awakened in her the desire to fight for her mother's life at all costs. A few months of trials lay ahead of them. Everything the girl had saved up by the time she was 30, their home and most of their possessions, had gone to pay for the surgery. At least they were glad they didn't have to take out expensive loans. The doctors did what they could to save her mother, and for a time she felt better. The world is not without good people, and in the villages there are many empty homes without owners. Getting to the position of Dorothy and her ailing mother, the village council allocated them a hut on the edge of the village, and it seems after what she had gone through. But her mother's health, her condition did not last long, and she became worse again. Despair overwhelmed Dorothy. She did not know what to do, how to help. The terrible parents in the hospital said that after this operation, domestic medicine is powerless, and only abroad there is a chance of recovery. Where would they get the money for such an operation if they had nothing of their own left? The teacher ran around to charitable organizations, foundations, applied to government agencies. Everywhere she listened with understanding, nodded sympathetically. But I could feel their contempt. Dorothy, what are you trying to do? People her age are dying by the numbers. What do you want? The charities were softer. They explained that people were more willing to donate to save children than to save the elderly. Dorothy stood in front of a medical rescue center. The honest institution happened to catch her eye in an advertisement. It was a short drive. She was especially interested in the possibility of paying for treatment in installments. It was unusual, so the girl decided to try her luck. She was politely met at the reception of the medical center and was asked to wait after listening attentively. The administrator returned after a short time and invited her to follow her. Dorothy was led to the director's office with a glimpse. She noticed a familiar name on the door sign. What was her surprise when she saw, seated behind the luxurious principal's chair, John, the same John who had bullied her at school. Dorothy, the medical center owner's eyebrows went up. John, you are unrecognizable. She realized she didn't have to wait for him to help her. She just stood there in front of him, her eyes fixed on the floor. He was a handsome young man, handsome in appearance. Spread out at the shoulders, black as his hair in a three-piece suit, made him extremely personable. You could feel the business acumen in him. His prickly gaze studied the girl, like a surgeon examining a patient before making his first incision. How beautiful you are, Dorothy. Honestly, I still feel bad about what a jerk I was in high school. We're adults now. Still, I'm sorry. Don't just stand there, come and sit down. What can I get you? Tea? Coffee? Maybe something stronger? My classmates don't come to my place that often. It's the wrong age, you know. He hesitated when he saw the tears in her eyes. How beautiful was she? A hunter had awakened in him, but first it was necessary to know the reason for her visit. He asked her to tell him about the problem, and Dorothy told him everything. Her mother's plight, the fact that they were now living in an old hut in the suburbs. About the fact that there was no money, that surgery was only possible abroad. That's what happens when people pour out their hearts to people they don't know well, knowing that they will never meet again. Dorothy didn't believe in helping John. She knew that they were seeing him for the first and last time, and so she was very frank. He listened attentively and occasionally asked probing questions. When it came to the diagnosis, the procedures performed, or the doctor's ideas, as soon as she shut up. He said, "You know, the devil is not as bad as he painted it. I think it can be solved. And I'm sure that with my connections and my father's connections, we could arrange everything for considerably less money. The trouble is a few things. The bank won't give you an installment plan because your income is small and you have no assets. What are you going to do, John? You know, we could talk about it tonight. There's a restaurant not far from here." John started talking. "My mother's waiting for me at home. There's no one to sit with her, so I won't be eating out anytime soon." Dorothy cut him off. John thought about it. "If you don't want to, you don't want to. Well, let's look at it from a different angle. I've just seen you, and I admire you. You're the most beautiful, slender lady I've ever seen, and even sadness suits you. But I wouldn't want you to be sad. John, help me again. It's not that simple. I'm willing to help you, even support myself and my mother. I have enough money for that. Anyway, I want you to be my girlfriend, my lover. Call it what you like. But this is my offer, full treatment and rehabilitation for your mother. In return, I get you." Dorothy was slapped in the face by a former classmate's offer. She couldn't go through with it. She was choked with tears and resentment, and she stormed out of the office without saying goodbye. Time passed. Mother was getting worse day by day. Dorothy found it increasingly difficult to convince her that all was well, and that soon her mother would be well, the light in her eyes fading. The indifference just fell. Dorothy pondered John's proposal for a long time. The first flame of anger and denial gradually turned into an acceptance of the fact that she had no other choice. She had nothing that could help. All that remained was herself. She's a commodity, a commodity, a commodity, a commodity whose price is her dear mother's help. She resolved to go to John again. The teacher again asked a neighbor to look after her mother, dressed up in the best clothes she had, though even in this, she did not recognize her. It was impossible to wear a strict teacher, and headed for the bus stop. A bus was just about to come to the district center, where the medical rescue center was located. Unable to see anything in front of her, she walked in the middle of the road and repeated, like a mantra, "I am a commodity." She was roused from her thoughts by the squeak of brakes and a loud car horn. "The road is for cars. I had enough of living." Out of the black SUV, a furious young man jumped out. Dorothy looked up. It was Charles, the same Charles she had once loved, and the love she had carried through the years, and now, I'm sure, was on her way to betray. Charles recognized her. Charles recognized her too, though not without difficulty. "Dorothy, where are you going?" "To the bus stop. I'll give you a lift. Why don't you tell me why you're so fed up with life that you throw yourself in front of cars like a suicide bomber in front of a tank?" Elizabeth got in silently. "Dorothy, am I serious? What's the matter with you? I'm rarely here in the capital. I do not let go, so I do not know what you have going on here." Tears began to fall behind the girl's eyes. It was easier to tell everything than her first and only love in her life, whom, however, she did not know it. Still, she gathered her strength, as she had done when she brought the pies to the stadium, and began her story. She talked for a long time. They had already come to a stop. Dorothy didn't stop. Charles listened silently, not interrupting, not elaborating. He just grimly. As the story unfolded, only one thing about the proposal to John, limiting himself to the disclaimer that she had visited a medical rescue center and that she had been turned down by John there. He finished just as the bus came to a stop. Dorothy was caught up, but he stopped her, didn't he? "Where are you going?" Are you going to look for ways to save your mother? I still have one left. You don't have to look for anything. Just stop. It's going to be okay. How's that? Thank you, of course, for the ride. It was really good to see you. But I really have to go. I'm telling wife to look for ways. Remember when I helped you out in high school? Let's do it again. Charles winked with a smile. I really liked your pies. Charles stopped joking. Thought I would be offended. But Charles repeated with pressure to sit down and drive back. I'll go to your parents, to your mother. It's my turn to tell you what happened on this 10-year anniversary. Dorothy obediently sat down. She didn't believe Charles' words about saving her mother, but seeing him awakened the teacher's feminine dignity. She was no longer that silly little girl, and she had learned to look the problem and the interlocutor in the eye, because she realized Charles really is not lying and does not want to hurt her. About him, you could say that life was good. Among the tens of thousands of those who rushed to conquer the capital, published on the road, Falls to the Bottom, or returning defeated to his native province, he broke through to his place in the sun. By organizing a construction crew, he first promoted himself to a construction company that was making $1 billion on new buildings. Then the restaurant business drew him in, and by the age of 30, he already owned a chain of restaurants all over the capital. And he did not have to complain about the lack of money. He recently played a wedding again. At that time, he showed on the screen of his mobile a picture of a young girl who could hardly be considered 20 years old. Beautiful model appearance, a bright image, is not unlike the modest, not fraternal village beauty Dorothy. It acquired bitterness because Charles was not destined to come true, and he did not notice this change. So engrossed in the story. So Dorothy, the money will come, and don't you dare refuse. He finished his narration. I'm very grateful, but I can't accept it for nothing. Scratched his chin, Charles. Then there will be another one. No, I do not offer intimacy. I am in need of a cleaner in my new house. I'd be delighted to have you in that position, especially if you spoil us with the occasional pie. My wife isn't good at cooking, and there's no substitute for a home-cooked meal. And who will I leave my mother with? And my mother will recover until she goes back to the farm, to which, judging by your story, she is so eager. I won't take you home myself, but that's the deal. The salary, by the way, will surprise you pleasantly. You'll help your mother. Again, I agree, whispered Dorothy. What? What? Did not hear a smiling Charles. I agree, Dorothy exclaimed, and she laughed a ringing laugh. She hadn't heard her own laughter in a long time. The operation had paid off. After the stress, the moving, and the rehab period, her mother began to get back on her feet as quickly as she had faded before. She was infectious with positivity. The joyful excitement of a daughter who believed that now everything was going to be okay. For the next few months, Dorothy returned to her teaching job, since she wasn't afraid to leave her mother alone. About once a week, Dorothy contacted Charles and kept him informed of how the treatment was going. He would carve out a spare minute and listen to her joyful nourishment. It made him feel warmer. At heart, he felt no sympathy for Dorothy as a girl, but some semblance of a close friendship between the former classmates had developed. 6 months later, Mom finally recovered and went back to work. On the one hand, it was easier for her to bear the separation from her daughter when she returned to work, but on the other hand, she was still sad, alone in the hut in the evenings. But Dorothy would not admit it, not wanting to upset her daughter. When Dorothy first got into Charles's house, she felt like Cinderella, who got to the royal ball, and the prince, Charles, gives her detailed instructions. Which room was for what? There were about 12 rooms in all and 5 staff, 2 maids, a cook, a gardener, and a caretaker. All were elderly but knowledgeable. The servants lived in the left wing of the house, while the owners lived in the right, so as not to disturb each other. The entire staff, from the moment Dorothy arrived, obeyed her. It was difficult at first, because she had never managed people before. But then the experience of teaching at the school came into play. All of the staff was cautious at first about accepting the change, but then they found common ground. Everyone liked the modest, serious girl who asked but did not order, did not hesitate to help if necessary, and helped everywhere. Justin, the watchman, chuckled that Dorothy was still in business with Charles. John always knew how to take more from life than others. This ability allowed him to wisely use the money of his parents, who generously gifted him with the admonition that this was his road to life, which meant it was now up to him whether he could build a functioning business or the pro would be everything, breaking his own destiny, a rambunctious lifestyle, as the offspring of wealthy parents often do. John respected himself and therefore set a goal and strove tirelessly toward it. His path to conquering the capital was thorny and winding. The right acquaintances, intrigue, recruitment, luring the best doctors to his side, the rare but so necessary bribes. John did not bend in the ways of achieving his goals. And when it was time to look and the results of his efforts, he realized his network of medical rescue centers was ready to conquer the capital. The tried and true scheme did not fail, and this time quietly sneaked in, making sure to enter the market for medical services. Salvation gained a decent reputation for itself. The only disadvantage John felt was having to move to the capital himself, where the riotous lifestyle did catch up with him. Casey was only 20 when she met Charles. He was an attractive guy in every sense, rich, smart, handsome, and provincially naive. It was perfect to stop jumping down the runway all day long in order to stay afloat and keep up with the competition. Among dozens of similar beauties, they met at a fashion show where Charles dragged them for fun. His designer friend Charles looked like an elephant in a china shop in high fashion. That's how he caught the girl's attention. She impressed him with her beauty and grace. With what? Nature has fully rewarded the girl with these qualities. After the show, she happened to be nearby. A conversation began, and it became clear that Charles was captivated. Despite the beauty, the girl was unlucky to be born in a poor family, and she hated this poverty with all her soul because she stopped at nothing to get to the top, to grab a piece tastier and eat faster, until the same hungry people ripped it out of their mouths. No such problems were foreseen in the council, so she went on the offensive. The stimulus was added to the model's short lifespan. She wasn't making much of a living either, unless it was at the expense of her daddy. But it was hard to call her stupid because she understood beauty was an extremely fragile thing. And so it was time for her to retire to an honorary pension as the wife of some businessman in his 30s and live happily ever after. Love was out of the question in this party. While Charles was away at work that sometimes he couldn't get home for days, Casey, having removed her greed, was busy removing her lust. Occasionally finding younger lovers, she always took precautions, so she didn't go public anywhere and got away with it. The relationship between Dorothy and Casey didn't work out right away. Feeling power, she humiliated the servants while Charles was out of the house. Elderly people were worried about holding on to a profitable position. After all, the owner was not greedy then for a salary, and all the employees were happy, so their loyalty to Charles could only be shattered by the blackmail of Casey, who had brought everyone under her thumb. Like a true mistress of the house, Charles would casually tell his wife who Dorothy was, that they were classmates, that he had bailed her out, and now she would bail them out, that she was a good person. If Casey had loved her husband, she probably would have been jealous, except that she didn't care. All she cared about was the fact that affecting Dorothy the way she couldn't affect the rest of us, and the fact that her power in her own house did not infinitely infuriate the young fugitive. However, the next 10 years passed steadily and without any upheaval. Life went on as usual, and even Casey eventually got used to Dorothy, even tried to be friends with her. They even tried making pies together once, but Casey didn't seem to have the stomach for it. Relations between the couple grew cooler every year. The wife did not give birth to children. Charles did not insist, but the intimacy between them was becoming less and less frequent. Over time, the businessman gave up on it, retiring with his mind to work. He didn't want to cheat, he couldn't help it, so he just acted like a decent family man whose relationship had dulled over the years. He believed his wife was as faithful to him as any decent woman. Charles began to find pleasure in evening conversations about literature with Dorothy. He had not liked to read in school, and now he had acquired the habit of opening a book every day before going to bed. Given Dorothy's past work, he regularly looked to her for recommendations for one book or another. Afterward, they would sit around the fireplace and discuss a particular work. Casey was wildly bored to be present at such an action, so she preferred to go far. He had the temerity to read, holding an herbal infusion with both hands. The only thing Casey liked to cook for her husband and smelled like shoes periodically. Charles reasoned. Agreed, Dorothy, we obviously couldn't get through such a work in school at the time. I don't know about you. The only thing I remember from the school program was Natalia Rostova and the Sky of Austerlitz. That's not what the book is about, and certainly a schoolboy can't understand it, and adults do not think to read. No, because I do not agree. Literature is not just to give knowledge, but to educate children. She was silent and thoughtful, looking at the fireplace. Silence, Charles. Thus flowed a leisurely, cozy evening. The silence lingered. Suddenly a cup fell to the floor from Charles's hands. Dorothy turned her head at the sound and screamed. Charles fell to the floor with his mouth. He was foaming at the mouth. Something had to be done immediately. Dorothy began to call for help, to the screaming. Suddenly the wife was the first to come, when she saw her husband lying there in a fit. She was in a stupor for a few seconds. Casey, call an ambulance, please, pleaded a frightened Dorothy. Yes, there is a doctor I know right now at the great medical center. The girl went to call with a concerned look. She did not show that she was very worried about her husband's condition, unlike Dorothy. Charles's seizure, however, passed as quickly as it had begun, and he studied on the floor in the fetal position in an unconscious state. The next day, a depressed mood prevailed in the house. The servants all tried to mind their own business, away from their masters. Charles walked grimmer than a cloud. Charles, how do you feel? Dorothy asked when she saw him in the corridor. To tell you the truth, I don't feel very well. Physically, I feel much better. But mentally, I'm depressed. And Dorothy, what's the big deal? I was, and always will be just Charles from our class to you. That's good, isn't it? Still, I'd go to the hospital. You don't joke about these things. We should at least know what to do. Yeah, I understand. Casey's already called her famous center. We'll have breakfast now, and then we'll go with her. Honestly, I'd feel better if you were there when we did. That's nice to hear, but that's not how Casey would understand it. Dorothy rarely blushed. But now the embarrassment was added if with a balloon. As Charles noted to himself, for the umpteenth time hesitated his choice of spouse. Casey, as a faithful wife, is supposed to have followed her husband to the medical center, sharing the woes, her husband. They sat in the office of the therapist and listened to the terrible verdict. Charles had 3 months to live. The disease was incurable. Charles sat there like a fog, not really knowing what the doctor was talking about. Medicine had never been his element, so he trusted those people who bore the title of doctor. So you're saying that I have only 90 days? He interrupted the therapist's spatial speech about the causes, effects, and possibilities of his illness. The doctor paused in his explanation, looked at him over his glasses. Unfortunately, So far, the level of both our and foreign medicine allows only to study the phenomenon of this disease. Yes, we are not mature enough to cure it. There is no hope at all. The doctor smiled sadly and understandingly at Charles. There is always hope. After all, no one canceled the miracles. Well, thank you. Let us live through these difficulties. But as long as you're talking about a miracle, let's hope so too. We'd better be going. Goodbye. Goodbye. Jules got up, held out her hand to the doctor, and led the obedient newcomer husband out by the elbow. He was automatic on his feet, unable to see anything around him. Honey, come to your senses, will you? Casey shook his shoulder in an effort to bring her husband back to reality. Then she began hugging him, kissing him, stroking him, and finally cradling him to herself. He couldn't stand it and burst into tears like a little baby, but cute already. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Stroking him with all the tenderness of which Casey was capable. She looked dreamily into the distance, seeing her comfortable, well-fed, bright future without him. In the evening, when Charles had calmed down a little, and it was just the two of them in bed, she decided to bring up the question of inheritance. After all, you and I believe in miracles, and we have a choice. Now, after his wife's support, he believed again in the feelings between them. Charles was glad he wasn't alone in his grief. He even forgot to tell Dorothy about the results of his trip to the doctor. He and his wife returned home late at night as they had spent that evening together. No, unfortunately. I just remember growing, expanding. I remember how cautious you were, evaluating the pros and cons. How you moved forward with forethought, not afraid to concede something in order to get a bigger object in return. Everything always worked out for you because you calculated from beginning to end. And now, it's hard for you to do that. You're broke, you're depressed. But you know what I've been learning from you all this time, and I'm all ears now thinking. He thought Athena was the goddess of wisdom. He admired his wife so much for keeping her head when he broke down and the ground went under his feet. He admired her in a way he hadn't the day he met her, when she was plowing down the runway as effortlessly as a butterfly. If suddenly the miracle didn't happen, what would happen to your life's work? You see, I want, even if you don't make it through this damn disease, the memory of you will live on in your case. I'm ready to pick up the pieces of the case even now, to ease your soul. Do you believe me? I do, even though we haven't gotten along much in recent years. I think we'll be fine. But what's your point? Your parents are old now, and I don't think they need worry about the news of your illness. You have to agree with me. It's a property issue. If you sign your will over to them now, they'll figure it out. It's not like a man in the prime of life is just going to take his elderly parents as heirs. Wouldn't you? You're as sensible as ever, dear. That's why I had the idea that you should make me the heiress. And I'll pass on whatever you say to them or whoever you wish. Before you start arguing, let me remind you that this is just a precaution, in case you don't work a miracle. And yet, I believe in you, my beloved. You're thinking straight, so give me until morning. Morning will be better in the morning. Now let's go to bed. It's been an eventful day. I wish it had been bad. Sleep well. I love you. Love you too. The next day they went to the notary and formalized Casey as the heiress. Charles decided to take his wife for a property inspection. At the same time, just in case, explaining to her how things were set up, showing a bunch of data contacts, introducing her to his subordinates. No one understood why it was the chief decided to show the employees his wife, whom they had never seen, and some did not even know of her existence. She behaved with everyone in a friendly way, taking an interest in the processes. This was alarming. But everyone kept quiet. John had made a lot of money in the last 10 years. His network of medical centers had expanded, and there were already plans to open new branches abroad. It was just a matter of licensing and certification. Beneath such a noble cause as saving people was hiding another side of John's activities. Because in addition to the huge profits from the rescue, he made even more money on underground gambling houses and casinos. Among this kind of public, he had a very extravagant approach to disguise. John at one time came up with the idea that the road to the casino was paved with good intentions, and so he began setting up dormitories for the homeless in the basements he had bought and equipped them to be quite tolerable living conditions for the homeless. And behind the secret doors began a world opposite the unsightly facade of poverty and hopelessness. In addition to the double bottom in such establishments, there was another thing. The casino also had its own secret room, where only a select few went. Gangsters in power, businessmen, all those whose connections could somehow benefit John. They came here in the evenings and sometimes at night. He participated in poker games, sometimes giving in, trying to sweeten the pill for this or that useful person. He miscalculated only once. Cross. The capital's criminal mastermind got to him by accident. The gangster's business was a lot of unsightly things. For him, killing a man was only a question of price. If the victim would pay more than his employer, he was easily ready to kill, and that he feared. And yet John's services were used. One night he lost enough to make the Cross interested in killing him, but he was willing to pay a large sum to stay alive. A few years before that ill-fated evening, Casey and John had become lovers. The girl, and out of boredom through acquaintances stumbled upon such an original casino, so sometimes spent evenings at roulette. John saw an interesting young lady on the security cameras. He liked her almost immediately. By the end of the evening, they had already played strip cards, and neither lover has regretted it since. Casey saw him as a kindred spirit, for he was too kind with an inflated sense of justice. Too decent Charles was too bland for her. And the former model saw life with him as a dull but lucrative job. Investment in pensions. Sarkozy, on the other hand, felt like a brightly saturated moth that flew to the flame. If she did not support herself constantly, it could be called love. The casino owner, however, reciprocated. He liked this calculating girl with the appearance of an angel. They ended up staying with each other for several years, almost becoming an unofficial family. One day, John saw a picture of Charles on Casey's phone. When her legal husband called her on one of his dates, the face seemed vaguely familiar, and he didn't hesitate to ask Khaki about his spouse. She told him without a backward glance about her family, about how ill Charles was, and how her life would be easier if there were no intermediary between Charles's wealth and hers in the form of Charles himself. John had already considered the possibility of avenging her childhood grudges, and with profit as well. Why not come out of the shadows and become a legal husband and wife? After all, if Charles died, the young widow would be a very tasty piece. After the case of the Cross, this dowry became a vital necessity, for he could not withdraw his funds from the bailout without attracting the interest of the tax authorities. And Charles's money would have made it much easier to repay the debt, especially since Cross began withdrawing the interest, and like a typical thug, rounding them up not in favor of the debtor. He hadn't told Casey about his misadventures, but one night when they were lying in bed together, he suddenly remembered, "You and I once talked about your money and got fed up with mediating between them. Yes, I know it may be unpleasant for you that I have to sleep with someone else besides you, but I started to make excuses." But John put his finger to his beautiful lips. "I think I have a solution to the problem." Casey was silent. "Look." John pulled out an unsightly vial. "You know, the only difference between poison and medicine is the soda. What does your husband like to drink? An herbal tincture. He sleeps better with it. Stress, work. That's why Charles has insomnia a lot. You want some? Yes, I do. And so do you. Don't worry. My pharmacists were spoiling it. That's why the prescription is rare. The substance itself dissolves quickly. You have to drop a little in your tea, and in a couple of months you'll be a happy young spoon. This is our chance to be together. I'm afraid, Casey admitted. So am I. But I don't see any other way out. The mistress took an ampoule. Now we must not see each other for a while, so as not to arouse suspicion. The first time it's okay to get sick. Bring him to me. To the rescue. Here's the address. Wow, ironic like a rescue. The lovers really started hiding. And for a while, Casey played the role of the loving wife, the dying spouse. For everyone else, though, Charles was healthy, and for a month the incident with Charles's seizures was forgotten. There were no more of them. But Charles faded day by day. He had a puffiness under his eyes. Bags appeared. The sturdy man gave them away. Dorothy saw the change, but thought it wrong to pry into the life, though a friend, but first and foremost an employer. And the housekeeper expected that if she saw fit, Charles himself would share the trouble. But he was in no hurry. One evening, Dorothy drove with a grocery list for the cook to the nearest supermarket. Just as she pulled into the parking lot, Casey's car was noticed. This surprised Dorothy somewhat, for in 10 years she could not remember Charles's wife buying anything at the store herself. An involuntary suspicion crept into her soul, which was confirmed as soon as she saw the couple kissing. When she found out about Arcadia's man, she was simply speechless. How small was the world? Dorothy hurried away from what she had seen and only remembered after a while why she had come to town. She was shaking with indignation at the injustice. After all, a man like Charles deserved anything but cuckold status. For Dorothy, it was something akin to a personal tragedy. When she'd been rejected by that tall, muscular teenager outside the stadium, she decided to keep quiet. It was none of her business, and she didn't want to upset her friend because she knew that Charles wouldn't be ceremonious with his thirst for justice until 1 p.m. Their fireside literary gatherings had become very rare since the seizure. Tonight was one of those evenings when not everyone was ripe for conversation. Dorothy, didn't we discuss Tolstoy to the end then? The way you so actively imposed on me Dostoevsky and his idiot. Didn't you like the book? Very much, but somehow too much about me, laughed the master of the house. Why do you say that? Idiots do not achieve all this. I looked around at Dorothy's interior. If you remember, in the book, the main character understood something that I realized only recently. It's all vanity. I'm forced to confess to you what? Living, I have 3 months left at the most. Smitten, Dorothy. Only flapped round your eyes. That's after the seizures. Yes. That's why I want to catch the highlights in the time I have left. These evenings are the nicest thing that's happened to me in a while. Wait. What was the name of the medical center? Where did you and Casey go for your checkups? Oh, I remembered that reassuring name. They didn't have for me. Dorothy began to think. She asked Charles to be quiet and listened from beginning to end to what she had to say. The housekeeper reminded her of the slop incident at school and the fight that followed. After all, John then recounted how John, as director of the Medical Rescue Center, had offered her treatment for her mother in exchange for Dorothy becoming his mistress. At the end, she dared to tell the story of what she had seen John and Casey outside the supermarket kissing. I'm sorry because I didn't mean to upset you. He sat there with his head down. Too much new in such a short time made him think deeply. I really am an idiot. Dorothy, let's make a deal. This conversation supposedly didn't happen. But if it really happened, I'll tell John. And then we'll think together. You're in business. Of course, there's nothing to think about. Charles, through his sources, decided to check on the rescue. His firm built houses for both high-ranking security officials and bandits. People were willing to pay good money. Charles was willing to work hard, so he remained friends with many clients, even after the builders turned in the project. John really had a nose for it, and it came out pretty quickly. A network of casinos and gambling houses. From the criminal circles, Charles was whispered that John had lost a lot to the cross, and the story of how he had furnished the casino was spreading throughout the capital. The picture was unpleasant, but solvable. The only thing, he found it difficult to believe in his wife's infidelity. After all, they had lived together for 10 years. He decided to follow his wife. This was not difficult, as the former model is somewhat used to the fact that she can be wherever she wants, whenever she wants, and there is no control over her, and did not even notice a tail behind her. Charles still doubted the existence of the bum casino. Still, as Casey headed for one of the dilapidated half-abandoned houses, there was nothing to lose. Charles headed a little further away. The wife did go down into the basement. When Charles followed her, he came upon a dozen homeless people, warming themselves by the heaters or sleeping in bunks. It was as if the wife hadn't even been here. The businessman looked out for the cleanest of the homeless and, in exchange for his good quality jacket, got a comprehensive account of where the woman had gone and what was really here. Out of rage, Charles went outside, inhaled. 1, 2, 3. The place seemed to infect him with excitement. He longed for revenge, but he decided to do it the tricky way. He began by deciding to pour the herbal infusion into the fireplace. That was the only concern Casey had. Which means 2 months later, your husband's bed was gone. Casey couldn't hide her delight at the prospect, though the naive fool had still left her a gift from beyond the grave. The widow was already rubbing her hands together in anticipation of taking possession of Charles' estate. But it turned out that he had annulled the will, which they had made after learning about the illness. The woman asked if there was a new one, to which he received a negative answer. This made her happy because the only thing she needed to enter into the inheritance. It is only to hide her son's death from his parents for 6 months is not such a long time. She had waited 10 years. She would wait another 6 months. Casey went to John, right after the notary's office. Can you believe it, John? We did it. We made it. She jumped on her lover's neck, kissing and clasping him in her arms. And I didn't tell you we were in the same class, buddy. Oh, I've been through a lot from him. That's weird. I thought he was kind of harmless. Yeah, but he's not. Anyway, forget about him. Forget about him. Who can forget the past? Think about what the future holds for us. In fact, let's go somewhere by the sea. The Maldives, for example. A honeymoon, so to speak. You know, darling, you're right. We can't just not celebrate with a vacation. It's been a long time since I've had a vacation. I haven't had an excuse. That's fine. Then I'll just run and make reservations. What about the brunette? Did he look meaningfully in the direction of the bed? We'll see about that. You guys are always thinking about one thing. All kisses, love, run. John didn't say anything. Let the girl spoil herself. She deserved it. They had a hard day tomorrow, and today they had a dozen more calls to make to the deputy. The tropical sun did not want to leave the returning Karina. They drove away from the airport. They each went about their business, of which they had a lot on their plate. It was time to get back to the harsh routine of paperwork and the sale of businesses. They should also sell the house and get ready to move in with Arcady, looking for them to play a wedding. Casey seems to have allowed herself to love John when she stopped depending on money. On the drive up to the house, she was unpleasantly surprised by Dorothy's car parked at the gate. Strange, she'd fired that hillbilly dumpster before she'd even left. What the hell is she still doing here? What are you trying to steal? Well, I'll show her now. Take the guard too, and take him outside. Who guards like that? The new mistress of the mansion was indignant. She flew into the house in a whirlwind and stood like a stone. The fireplace was burning. On opposite sides of it sat two Dorothy and Charles, who must be dead Charles, whom she had seen in a coffin, whom she herself had led into that coffin. Where had he come from? Apparently the emotion was red, for Charles's face quite alive, blooming with merriment. Dorothy was about to leave, but Charles gestured for her to stop. Well, hello. How many years, how many winters? I see Charles is on fire in person. He's come for you from the other side of the world. Come on, this was his moment of triumph. That's what it was all about. So Charles rightly felt he had a right to gloat. Don't. Casey took a chance. What do you mean, don't? No bread, no wine, no heat, and let's go to bed. I liked it personally. Don't, I beg of you. Casey was about to faint. Her whole world was falling apart. She didn't know what was going on. What was so mystical? How could this happen if she was digging herself? Poison was picking her own soda. It couldn't have survived. What are you, darling? I forgot I didn't check in with the notary. I thought I'd come back and give you all the money I earned with these hands. Come on, let's hug. Casey's nerves failed. She ran faster to the car. John, he'd know what to do. Say she got a wink from the always silent Charles. Let him ride. She smiled briefly. It was amusing to watch the emotions of the man whose love she had carried through her life. He was triumphant now. Casey, despite her rich life, didn't love easily, but now she'd run a few red lights and nearly had an accident once. She didn't notice anything. She was just speeding along at breakneck speed. Fortunately, it was late, and there were hardly any pedestrians on the streets. Hurry up, John, honey. Here another blow was waiting for her. She made it just as John was being placed in handcuffs in the police car. Casey realized their entire plan had been revealed. Charles was taking revenge. Revenge, the way only people who put justice above all else are capable of. We'll file for divorce. You give up your claim to the property, or you're going. What about the food? The car, too. Return the things collected are at the gate. The text message sounded like a verdict. Charles decided to sell the house in which he had been keeping a snake in his pocket for 10 years. Fortunately, a buyer was found quickly. His deputy decided to buy property away from the city, and Charles gave him a good price on old friendship. What unspeakably pleased the young cheetah? Naturally, as long as the old staff remained, and as long as they were treated well. And she and Dorothy still had many moments to go through. This time a pleasant one. Casey had no choice but to return to her parents' house, who was forever despised for being poor. The model century is short. Hers has passed. So said all those who once smiled and worshipped and admired. And now she was broke. She didn't want to work, and she couldn't want to work. And she couldn't, her mother grumbled about raising this thread, but she fed it. All Casey had to do was feel sorry for herself, flip through social media, and reminisce about her life. She wandered over to Charles' page and saw that she and Dorothy had been married not too long ago. Charles's new wife's eyes lit up with a joyful fire. It was clear from the newer photos that the former housekeeper was also pregnant. She would give Charles his firstborn child. What a fool I am. Through tears, Casey exclaimed. But at least, by the age of 30, did not fail to realize it jabbed her mother from the kitchen.